In rural Sweden is a small, secluded island called Sörkö. Sörkö lies in the Småland region, an area of land that's approximately 32,000 kilometres square in size and only has about 710,000 people living there. To put that into perspective, Sweden's capital of Stockholm has about the same number of people living in it, but is only 188 kilometres square, and the island of Sörkö is one of the least inhabited islands in Småland. To say everyone knows everyone in Sörkö would be no exaggeration of the truth, and in 1967, everyone on the island knew everyone to the point where they could immediately tell if someone wasn't from the island just by looking at their car. Which was why it was so surprising when a case, almost unlike any other in Swedish history, cropped up in such a remote and close-knit community. It all centres around a 13-year-old boy named old-alvar-larsson. Alvar was much like any other teenage boy anywhere in the world at the time, only he was growing up on a farm. He helped out with farm work, spent time with the neighbours, and when his mother woke him up at 7:30 a.m. on Sunday, the 16th of April 1967, he got up and started getting ready to go to church. He ate a bun, drank some fruit juice, and then asked his mother if he could go out for a walk before the family headed to church that day. He wasn't dressed in his Sunday best just yet, but his mother knew he couldn't go that far, and it sounded like a good idea. She told him that he could go on the condition that he brought some firewood back with him on his way, and Alvar agreed to do just that. Alvar took off. He left his pocket money, his bike, and all of his belongings behind him. He only had light clothes on and his clogs, not even his work shoes or his boots, and he didn't come home in time to enjoy breakfast with the rest of the family. When he was late for breakfast, his mother did get a bit anxious. She called the neighbouring farms and asked if any of them had seen Alvar, but the answer was the same wherever she went. When Alvar still hadn't shown up a while later, his father then called a group of neighbours, and the men all met up to start searching the farmland, hoping to bring Alvar home soon. However, they came back empty-handed. By 2:30 p.m, when no one on the tiny island of Sörkö could find any trace of Alvar, they informed the police. There was a policeman living close by, and he began leading search parties that combed the whole island and lasted well into the night. The next morning, when Alvar was still missing, and it didn't look like he would be found anytime soon, the local police called in reinforcements. By Monday afternoon, 50 servicemen from an army regiment stationed nearby arrived and began systematically searching the island. The police conducted interviews with everyone, asking if they had seen any missing vehicles, and checked to see if all the local boats were accounted for, but they still came back with no answers. Everyone's vehicles and boats were right where they had left them, and no one could remember seeing any unusual vehicles around the island during the time that Alvar had gone missing. On Tuesday, more people arrived to help in the search. A helicopter was sent in from Stockholm, and teams were sent out on boats to search the local waters, especially when Alvar's family revealed that the teenager didn't actually know how to swim. The investigators became nervous and feared that the boy had somehow ended up in one of the lakes, but his clogs weren't found near any of the shorelines, and again there was no trace of Alvar. It wouldn't be until 1978, over 10 years after Alvar was reported missing, that there was the first bit of movement in this case. A woman came forward claiming that a relative of hers had boasted about how he had killed a young boy in Småland during 1967. According to this witness testimony, this man had claimed that he'd stashed the boy's body near his summer home for 2 years before he'd finally moved the boy's remains to his final resting place. The man allegedly laid the boy at the bottom of a grave that was being prepared for one of this man's relatives. He then covered the boy's body with spruce twigs before the coffin of the man's relative was laid to rest on top of it and covered the whole thing up. But this witness testimony was perhaps hearsay at best. The man in question had been celebrating his 50th wedding anniversary the day that Alvar had gone missing, and he'd actually been working the night before, leaving little to no chance for him to do what he'd allegedly claimed to do. But it was the first time anyone had come forward with any information on young Alvar, and the police were determined to investigate. They actually opened the grave, perhaps hoping to find Alvar, perhaps not, but when they removed the coffin and reached the bottom of the gravesite, they found nothing. Alvar was still missing, and no one had any idea what fate had befell him. But some of the mystery around his sudden disappearance was solved in 1982, when 3 hunters made their way to a deserted island in Osnan. The men were training hunting dogs, and all 3 of them got into a rowboat and headed to the island of Klasu, which was almost 4 miles away from Alvar's home in Sirku. While training their dogs, the men stumbled upon a human skull, lying on a bed of leaves in one of the bays. The skull had a large hole in the back, which led the hunters to believe that they may have found an archaeological site, but then they found something else that changed their minds. When they checked what remained of the skull's teeth, they found modern fillings and realised that they had uncovered something far more gruesome than an old Viking burial site. They called the discovery into the police, who immediately feared that the hunters had found what remained of Alvar. They checked the skull's teeth against Alvar's dental records, and unfortunately they were a match. The police immediately searched the island, hoping to find the rest of Alvar's remains and more clues as to what happened to him, but almost unbelievably, they came back empty-handed once again. Even the skull that had been found didn't end up amounting to much. The hole in the back of Alvar's skull had looked like a major clue in the investigation, and at least suggested foul play, but it had actually been so long since Alvar had gone missing, over 15 years to be exact, that the investigators couldn't determine if Alvar had received a blow to the head or his skull had been broken by the elements. In many ways, the discovery of Alvar's skull only raised more questions. It looked like he couldn't have died that long after he'd gone missing. The investigators estimated that he probably died around the same time, or that Sunday night by the latest, but that only made the question of how Alvar ended up on that deserted island even more confusing. None of the residents of Sirku had reported any of their boats having been missing at the time, and Alvar could not swim. A search of the island of Klasu uncovered 2 boats, but the owners also quickly came forward to explain that it would have been impossible for Alvar to have used them to get to the island over 15 years before. So how did he get there, and where were the rest of his remains? The very next day after Alvar had gone missing, the investigators began running with the theory that Alvar had met with foul play. They'd first feared that Alvar had been kidnapped, a theory that only grew stronger when reports of boys matching Alvar's description started coming in from neighbouring areas. But the locals hadn't spotted any foreign cars in the area, and if someone had kidnapped Alvar, they would have needed to get him away as quickly as they did. Another theory was that Alvar had run away himself. He could have hitchhiked out of Sirku and maybe fallen victim to a predator or simply gone his own way, but again, no one had spotted a car they didn't recognise on the roads that morning. He also hadn't taken any of his belongings or his money, and he'd been wearing his everyday clothes, not anything he would have wanted to be caught exposed to the elements in. And of course, with the discovery of his skull, we now know that Alvar died around the same time that he disappeared, which raised even more questions. What if it wasn't that he died shortly after he'd been reported missing, but shortly before instead? Rumours began to circulate that either Alvar's father or Alvar's older brother had something to do with his disappearance. After all, the only person who claimed to have seen Alvar that Sunday morning had been his mother, and maybe she'd been convinced to cover something up. A theory was that Alvar and his father had gotten into a fight that had turned physical and ended with an accident. The same theory began to circulate about Alvar and his older brother, and then rumours placed different members of the Larsson family on boats, hiding Alvar's body on the island of Klasu before they'd covered their tracks by reporting Alvar as missing. However, of course, this is just a theory. Was the discovery of his skull, and only his skull, a part of someone trying to lead the authorities to the truth after carrying the guilt of it for 15 years, or had it been some freak accident and an animal had simply dug it up? It's become increasingly impossible for the investigators to determine, but as time goes on, they've somewhat moved away from the idea that Alvar was met with foul play. As it stands today, the investigators lean more towards what happened to Alvar being an accident, and the truth is a little more chilling than that. Even if the investigators were to find some damning piece of evidence that would convince them that someone had actually murdered Alvar, the statute of limitations would mean that they wouldn't be able to prosecute his killers for their crimes anyway. With no other clues to go off of, Alvar's case remains unsolved. His family, friends, and the community of Turku have never had any answers or explanations for what happened to him, and they most likely, unfortunately, never will. His father died in 1979, before Alvar's skull had been discovered by the hunters, which also made it near impossible to fully investigate the theories that he had possibly something to do with his son's disappearance. But even if he had been alive, it wouldn't make the fact that a young life was cut so tragically short any easier to bear. It still leaves us with no answers and no understanding of Alvar's final hours.